if I were to like not do this today, would I just regret it later? Could I fix it if I regret it? It's the corollary to it. It's like, is there something that I'm going to regret that I cannot fix?
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
We're excited to sit down with Alessio Fanelli, partner and CTO at Decibel. Alessio's love for tech began in Rome when his mom came home from work one day with an old iMac G3 and continued when he dropped out of college to start his first company, Smart Torby. Years later, he found his way to the world of venture at 645 and now works as an early-stage investor at Decibel, focused on open source data engineering and cybersecurity. Welcome, Alessio.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's start with your upbringing in Torpegnatara, which is in Rome. And when exactly did your love for technology start?
In Rome, there's this concept of like a popular neighborhood, which is the common folk place. And then you have all the nice neighborhoods, right? You got the Colosseum, you got the Trevi Fountain, but people don't really live there. It was a nice upbringing. I didn't really have a computer yet until pretty far into my life. And I actually didn't have internet until I was like 12, 13 years old. So even though I had a computer, I didn't have the internet, and that's how I actually started thinking about coding and some of the stuff. I was just like, what do you do with a computer? There's the default apps on the Mac OS, and then there's not a lot more. So I wanted to figure out how to do some of that. And at the same time, I was starting to get into video games. My whole family, I kind of put money together to buy me a PSP, one of the PlayStation portables. I could only get like one game per year from them. So I was like, I want to play more than one game per year. And eventually learned a lot online about basically like what jailbreaking then became for iPhones on PSPs. And there's a lot of people that were influential at the time. One of them is George Hotz, who recently came on my podcast as a guest about 10, 12 years later. Everything kind of came full circle. But yeah, my love for technology was really having it as a tool to do things that I otherwise wouldn't have access to. That's always been a passion of mine, and that's why open source is so important to me too. Just being able to make it both accessible and also like a learning experience. When you're working open source, you're getting something, like the basic of it, you're getting something available for free, right? But the other side of it, you become part of a community that is building it. And if you have the interest, you can learn a lot, even though you might not have access to the same level of education that people in other countries could have. So yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Definitely. And I wouldn't say coding is the easiest skill set to learn. So was it mostly your intellectual curiosity and watching videos driving you to learn? Or how did you learn that skill set and then start building from there?
I started and gave up a bunch of times because when I started, I got to learn how to code C. And like C is probably one of the worst languages to start coding in because it's just so low level. So I was like, okay, I will start. And then it's like, okay, there's all these memory allocation errors. And then eventually I was just like, okay, I just got to do it. I just want to play the new Grand Theft Auto or whatever. There was some game that I was like, I need to get over this thing and just learn how to work with this stuff. That's what got me there. My dad, he went to work right after middle school, and my mom, she's an accountant now, so she's never done technology work. And I then ended up, as most kids that learn how to code do, then became the IT person of the family. So it's all been self-driven, but I think there are a lot of resources, especially once I got access to the internet. Before it was a little harder, but nowadays, if you're online, you can learn anything really.
Yeah, I'm sure every non-technical person with the tools that are out there will be able to code next year, just given like the pace of innovation. Then you stayed in Rome for college, but dropped out soon after starting university. Kind of walk us through that decision and if it was a hard one to make.
I would say most decisions in my life are pretty gut-based. Obviously, there's like a lot of thinking behind it, but for me, it's always like, okay, what feels right to me? And I think especially in Italy, the culture is very oh, you just got to go to school and get a degree, and then you got to try and find a job that is stable. And that's all you can really ask for in life. And most people are not really entrepreneurial. So there was definitely a lot of questions of why would you do that? It's like you're doing well at like a very high GPA, and it's like, why would you like drop out to do a company that doesn't make? I've never heard anybody do that. But to me, it was just like, I can always go back. I'm actually still enrolled in school technically, so I can still log in on like my student portal. I just haven't paid any of my dues. But yeah, so for me, it's always like, okay, what am I really? It's the Jeff Bezos regret minimization. If I were to like not do this today, would I just regret it later? Could I fix it if I regret it? It's the corollary to it. It's like, is there something that I'm gonna regret that I cannot fix? And dropping out of school is not something you cannot fix. You can always go back and do it. But starting a company is definitely something you can regret not doing, especially as you get older. It's like, you want to do it less and less because it's a lot of work. So you almost need the being so naive, being younger. It's like, yeah, I should totally start this company that competes against like Nest and other home automation software, but instead it's all open source and open hardware. And anybody who's actually went to maybe finish school would never start something like that. But that's kind of the power of entrepreneurship. You just learn a lot of lessons firsthand. So yeah, it wasn't really a hard decision for me. It was definitely maybe confusing to a lot of the people around me, but yeah, it felt pretty natural.
Right, because you started in a non-investor position, which I think nowadays, as it's getting harder and there's this massive supply and demand imbalance with people looking to break into venture, people are taking non-investor type roles just to hopefully transition into an investor role. Obviously, that was not your intention. You were maintaining the engineer focus, but then moved into an investor role. So maybe just quickly touch on that shift. First, the why, and then second, do you have any advice for other people trying to make that move?
So I joined 645 in 2017, end of 2017. So at the time, the firm was on the first fund, which was 7 million. The idea behind 645 was taking some of the software approach that the public equities investors would take in with very data-driven, like software-driven decision-making, and what Insight and some of these growth stage funds were doing in private with outbound sourcing flow. Namdi, who's one of the co-founders, 645, he used to be at Insight Venture Partners for like 9 years, and Aaron used to be at Goldman Sachs. So that was kind of the thinking. And I joined as an engineering fellow. So I was working there beginning like 10 hours a week, prototyping things and working with them through the ideas. And I think then a couple months in, I was like, okay, you can't really do this 10 hours a week. You need to actually start building an engineering team. So I joined there full time. I was the first full-time engineering hire. And I was really the only engineer for like 3 or 4 years, because with 7 million AUM, you don't get a lot of fees. So the first year that I worked there, I was still in Italy. So I was working remotely. The first annual meeting was like 2 days before my wedding. So the team was like, oh, can you come to New York for like the annual meeting? I'm literally getting married in like 2 days. I cannot come to New York and then fly back to Rome. I need to be here. So I was not there for the first one. The idea at 645 was always engineering and investment being very tightly coupled, so that you actually know what you're building for, versus a lot of other firms that have engineering and data as like a separate function. And it's really hard to build software that people want to use because they don't understand the challenges. So that was obviously like great for me to learn more about the investing side. But I literally went into the role. I didn't even know what venture was. I understand the concept from the outside, but like, I don't know anything that is going on. I had to build something that's like pre-post money valuation in the software. And I'm like, what is pre-post money valuation? Literally the most basic stuff. But I literally learned all of it on the job. I read some of like Brad Feld's book and whatnot, but I didn't really go to business school or anything like that. Switching to an investor position, there's a couple things. One, and that's thesis behind Decibel as well. I felt most people in venture don't have a technical background, and it's really hard at the pre-seed and seed stage to really impact the company. As you know, a lot of times when you do open source infrastructure, cybersecurity investments, it's almost always pre-product at the pre-seed and seed stage. And it's almost always pre-product market fit at Series A. So the skill set that you need early on is very different. And at 645, I was the only person really doing infrastructure and security and whatnot. So nobody at the firm is really working on these deals at a high clip. So when I was building the software, I would see the company while I tested it. And I was like, okay, this company seems interesting. So the first investment I made, which I sourced through the software that I built, is a company called Panther Labs. So we invested in the seed round, and the company raised a Series B at a $1.4 billion valuations.
It'd be great to touch on and hear about Decibel's investment strategy, and also understanding your role as not only an investment partner, but a CTO.
It's funny, we were just saying, when do we want to make up our 5th anniversary, which is this year at some point. There's always, when you start a firm, there's different dates that you want to pick. But John Sakota was the founder of Decibel. He was previously at NEA for about 13 years as a GP. And yeah, the idea behind Decibel was the firm was born in partnership with Cisco. So Cisco is one of our main LPs, both in Fund 1 and Fund 2. And it's really, how do you build synergy between a large company that has its own corp dev and investment? So we're completely separate from Cisco. Like, outside of being an LP, there's no, like, Cisco doesn't have to vet our investments or anything like that. But when you're starting a new firm, you kind of need something, right? You cannot just be like, I have money. So for us, there was a strong partnership with Cisco, both on allowing our companies to access their customer base. So a lot of like co-selling and things like that, bringing all the Cisco founder advisors, we call them, into the Decibel network. So Cisco is a large company. They acquire a lot of companies. So a lot of those folks end up being then advisors to our companies as well. And third, a lot of opportunity to learn through Cisco some of the enterprise needs. So there's kind of the co-selling part, but to co-sell, you need to have a company. Before you co-sell, you want to figure out what are like some of the investment trends in the enterprise that are maybe not as clear to a lot of folks. So those were 3 of the core pillars of the initial partnership. I would say nowadays, most people don't even know about the Cisco piece. And they're obviously, we love them and they're great partners. We do a lot of events together, but Decibel is Decibel. We're our own firm, and Cisco Investment is its own thing. But yeah, you'll find that, for example, I invested in a company called Ort, which is an identity security company, which was acquired by Cisco recently, independently. I didn't even know about it. Just to give you an example, it's like, I'm an investor in the company. I didn't even know about it from Cisco. But now the founder, he's at Cisco, and like we're collaborating on a bunch of things, AI and like identity threat detection and things like that. There's a lot of synergies and learning opportunities. And then investment strategy and role. Investment strategy is really simple. We do pre-product market fit investments in technical founders. It's the easiest way to think about it. That usually falls within data engineering, cybersecurity, developer tools. And then you can have AI as a bucket, which it's usually paired with one of the other 3. But we've done AI investments for a long time. We are investors in a company called Abacus AI. We're investors in a company like Credo AI. These are all 2-3 years old investments.
What does the CTO role entail at Decibel?
A lot of things. So obviously internal tooling. I still build a lot of stuff for the firm. We have like a research agent that helps us do research on companies. We have a CRM that is self-healing. So like constantly updates and retexting using GPT-4. We're also doing some exploration on incubating companies and building them with our own engineering team that we put in the company. There's just a lot of stuff that you can do when all you do is technical, because a lot of times it just starts in open source. I got a bunch of open source tools that I build, and sometimes it's like, oh, you can easily roll 1, 2, 3 of these into like a bunch of our companies that we use and just have them leverage it. So you kind of get economies of scale on AI adoption now with some of these tooling. There's just a lot of fun stuff. But yeah, it just like part of it is also like signaling. We have a benchmark model at the firm, but everybody's a partner and there's no seniority and whatnot. And having the additional like CTO title, when you're like a small team, you just make things up, right? So it's like, yeah, I'm the CTO. It's like, you reach out to a founder, it's like, hey, I'm the CTO. And it's like, oh, okay. So that means you built. You're just signaling, hey, I'm actually somebody, I'm reaching out not because I'm a like LangChain. It's like I reached out to Harrison when he first started the project because I wanted to build a project hub for them. And I was like, hey, it doesn't really matter that I'm a partner. That's not why I'm reaching out. The title is kind of like restrictive in a way. I'm reaching out to talk about the building side. A lot of people like that, and it makes the relationship feel less, oh, you're reaching out because you're an investor, you know. No, I'm reaching out as like any open source developer would do. I just work at a venture firm.
And it confirms you have technical experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Now diving into open source, which is one of your focus areas. And as you've mentioned before, you're pretty bullish on those types of tools. But maybe just to set the ground for the audience, can you first define open source versus closed source, why you are bullish on some of these open source opportunities?
So open source has a long history. If you go on my website, there's a post called a brief history of open source, which is very long. It's not very brief. But basically, it started at MIT. Initially, it was called Free Software. Richard Stallman, who came out with the Free Software Foundation thing, he was trying to use a HP printer and it wasn't working, but like the drivers were not available. So it was like, oh, everything should be open so that if something breaks, I can fix it myself. Today, when people think about open source, it's tooling that usually starts with a bottoms-up motion through GitHub. So HashiCorp is maybe a good example of this. HashiCorp, it's a publicly traded company now. They have a lot of open source developer tools like Vault, Terraform, things like that. These projects by themselves don't make money. They're just utilities. Vault helps you store secrets in a code base. Terraform helps you define cloud infrastructure configuration as code. And then they have the whole HashiCorp platform brings them all together into like a more enterprise offering. And I also have, if you also see on my website, and maybe we can put the links in the show notes, I have this other framework that I think about called monetization, Alex, for open source. So when developers are building something, the most important thing is like quickly evaluating if it fits my needs. In traditional SaaS, that's a freemium model, right? You sign up and you try it and then you have to pay later. You cannot really do that for development because it might take a while to actually build and experiment with something. You cannot do like a 7-week trial. So there's a lot of open source software that people can use and start. And so the Helix thinking is at the beginning when you're building, the value of something being reliable is 0. All you care about is speed of iteration and flexibility when building. And then as you go from building to deploying to like scaling the software, you actually don't care anymore that it's open source. You just want it to work. So now the value is flipped. The value is all about, can this thing be reliable instead of being open source? And that's what you see in a lot of the open source motion. You start with an open source project that can be used by developers, and then you sell an enterprise software that is usually like audit logs, role-based access control, all these things that are more large-scale enterprise adoption features. And that's something that has obviously worked really well for a lot of companies like MongoDB, Elastic, Databricks, a lot of them which our team has previously invested at our previous firms. And now you have AI, which is a whole different category of open source versus closed source. But the thing that we always like about open source is it creates a community and a movement without a lot of investment in a sales team early on. So you kind of have a very engineering driven culture at a startup, and that really resonates with open source communities. So it makes it really hard. It makes it really easy to start from there. And then it makes it really hard for somebody to come in and compete against you because it becomes synonymous with what the community is doing.
And then also from the venture investor side, you're betting on the fact that these open source communities will get enough traction and, to your point, can hopefully become enterprise motions where people will pay for the software at some point. Because I know that over the last few years, we did see this movement of a lot of funds betting on these open source projects or companies. And so that leads, I guess, to my next point of now going into open source models. I mean, do you see this area becoming commoditized or a bit of a race to the bottom?
Open source AI is probably the first time in the last 20, 30 years where you have software that people cannot run on their own. So any open source software that you've seen in the past, that can be Linux, that can be MySQL, that can be whatever else, you can download it and you can run it on your computer. That's really easy to do. Now, if you take, I don't know, Mistral 7AB, like the largest Mistral AI open source model, you cannot run it on your MacBook. You need like a pretty large machine to do it. So all of a sudden, the tension between what's open source and what people can actually use is very different. So before, where you might get in trouble with open source, you open source too much. Now you have something that people can do a lot with, and they're never going to pay you because there's really only a little incremental value you can put on top. AI is a little different, where you have different model sizes. So you have, for example, the models in the 7 billion parameters class, which you can quantize and run locally easily with something like a Olama or things like that. So those models are small and you can run them on your computer, but they're not very powerful. So that's kind of the new, like, small models, like the new freemium.
SLM, I think small language models.
The 7 billion parameters family is always a good way to try a model. For example, Mistral, they have 7, they have 30, and they have 70, I believe. So if the 7 billion is good, you should probably pay for the API of the 70 billion, because it's not 10x better. You know, models don't scale linearly with parameters count, but you can assume that it's going to be better than the 7B. So if you're a developer, you start with Mistral 7B, and then as you get to production, you're like, okay, I should probably switch to like a better model, because now I'm going to charge the customer for it, better NPS, blah, blah, blah. There's definitely a race to the bottom as far as AI inference. And we did a whole write-up about the AI inference wars and whether or not anybody... AI inference is basically running the model and then offering inference. Inference is like generations, basically. So when you ask ChatGPT, write a poem for me, it's running an inference to then return you the new tokens. The other things about AI models specifically is pricing has usually been about made up. So in databases, you add maybe gigabytes. You would charge a customer per gigabyte. With servers, you would charge a customer per hour of runtime. Now with models, you're charging per token, and you can think of a token as 3 letters, 4 letters, something like that. That's usually a good way to think about it. And all of a sudden, when you're offering inference to a customer, there's a couple things you can think about. The cost of the tokens you're generating basically is based on how many people are using the service at once. The more people use it at once, the cheaper it is for you to run the inference, because you're basically batching all of these things together. Like, you're taking all of the inputs. It's a little hard to explain in non-technical terms, but it's basically you're taking them all, you run them in one pass. Versus if you have one person at a time asking you, it costs you basically almost the same amount, because you're still doing a full pass through the model in the GPU. A lot of cloud providers are trying to get the price low so that then they can get more volume and make up on the cost. Versus others that have the best models like OpenAI, they don't really care because they're the only one with GPT-4. But if you're offering hosting of open source AI models, it's really important to get to high volume quickly, because it starts to subsidize a lot of the usage that the free tier gives you. I'm sure you might have seen the whole thing about Grok, this like new AI inference thing, which is started by Jonathan Ross, who built the TPU at Google, which is their own AI chip. The thing with Grok is Grok costs 5-6 more times than an NVIDIA card. It's a lot. The hardware is really expensive, but it scales so much better with concurrent usage. If you are a company that gets a ton of usage, you're better off buying the hardware that is a lot more expensive versus not. Versus before, the mental model that people had is, oh, the more customers I get, the worse it is in a way, because I just have to scale more servers, you know? Versus now, more people are actually only getting 10-20% utilization on their GPUs. And yeah, so you really want to get the volume up. So that's maybe a long-winded way to say that inference on the models is being commoditized pretty quickly, and it is a race to the bottom. But the hope that this provider have is that then they can use this concurrency to then make up for it in volume later, maybe rising some of the prices or upselling the customer to like better models that are more expensive to run and things like that.
Now we can turn it over maybe to Will and just touch on some of the metrics related to evaluating.
Alessio, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the quantitative side of assessing potential investments. Obviously, a lot of early stage investing is engulfed by understanding the qualitative side and the founders and the market. But I'm curious to hear if there are any actual metrics that you guys point to or evaluate, whether it is on the financial side of things, P&L related, or even on the usage side of things or product adoption. Any signals that you guys look to commonly across these types of investments?
There's a lot of signals that we see. Some of them, we built them in our sourcing software. So the financial stuff, there's really nothing interesting to say there. I think more on the adoption side, especially when it comes to open source. I think the how much is a open source star worth thing has been beaten to death. But for us, it's more qualitative. So actually I have this post that I've been published that I wrote 7 months ago, which is about open source community health. So stars are great. Like stars are like eyeballs. It's great to have eyeballs. But if people are actually using it, there's two things that are going to happen. One, they're going to ask for help. So they're going to open an issue on your GitHub project. Two, they're going to try and contribute to it. And so they're going to open a pull request on GitHub to make changes to it. Stuff that people maybe don't look at as much as like time to response for issues. It's like if you have an open source project, how quickly do you respond to people? Or how quickly does somebody else in the community jump in to help? The most successful projects, they have one, very high response rate. And two, the community is actually doing a lot of work too. So it's impossible for a seed stage company to scale support for an open source project that gets thousands and thousands of users because they just don't have the people. So you want people in the community that are not employees participate in it. So one thing that we track, for example, is also contribution by non-employees of the company. So you want to make sure that there's a high level of interest from people that are not getting paid to participate. That's one, for example. And the LLM side, I found most open source work really focused on like fine-tunes of models and stuff like that, which there's not a lot to look at. And I actually think it's one of the biggest wastes of time right now in open source AI, is trying to fine-tune a model just to be on the top of the Hugging Face leaderboard. And there's just so much there between people are definitely training on like evals data. If you, maybe for people that are not as familiar, the way AIs are tested and evaluated is a set of benchmarks. And we actually have an episode on our podcast called Benchmarks 101 that goes through all of them. But it's basically preset questions all the time. It's always the same question. Sometimes some model comes out and it's, oh, we beat every single model on this benchmark. But it's really easy to do it if in your training data, there's traces of the test in it. So a lot of open source models are, oh, we did great. And then people are like, oh, are you going to release the training data that you use? And it's like, no. Okay, then we're just assuming that you probably have some of the eval questions in there. That's a common rant in the AI circles, but it's basically model releases get a lot of interest outside of technical circles. People are like, oh, wow, you release a new model. You must be a serious AI company, but not really. It's really easy to do. But anyway, rant over.
But what do you think about like the proliferation of these new model companies? I mean, I feel like it's every week you're seeing a new team from Google DeepMind starting a different type of foundation model, and whether that be region specific, targeting a specific vertical. And I think a lot of them claim the wedge to be, technical PhD researcher type team, as well as having the best context. But from what we've seen, OpenAI's context is pretty good. So, outside of the large model providers today, of some of which we've mentioned on the show, I mean, do you think that any of these newer guys have the potential to challenge an OpenAI?
Yeah, I think there's definitely opportunities. So we've had a bunch of them on the podcast. We had Eugene Cha, who's the founder of a company called Recursal AI. They're building our WKV, which is another foundation model. But their whole thing is basically OpenAI, Cohere, Claude, all of these companies, they're building transformer-based models. You cannot beat them at the transformer game. They're just not enough. There's no way for you to get better data or to get more compute.
And how do you find transformer-based models?
Transformer-based model, they use this mechanism called attention, which comes from this paper written by Google in 2017. Attention is all you need. It's really hard to explain in basic terms, but you can think of transformers at like this thing called quadratic memory requirements for attention. So whenever you give it one token or n tokens, the amount of memory that they need is like n squared. So you can see how the memory grows very quickly. The way to beat these models is have subquadratic attention or subquadratic memory requirements. And you can think of it as if there was a chart in front of your eyes, it would be really easy to see how quadratic scales on a XY chart. But basically, all the companies that I think will have success trying to dethrone OpenAI and some of these companies are companies that are going to get there through different model architectures. And today, there are a few promising areas. So RNNs, which are maybe an older approach that are being built by, RWKV is one company in that space. These are all subquadratic architecture. So what that does is both less memory, but also you can have longer context. Again, I've had that thinking before. It's, oh, why do we need all this context? I don't need to put a book every time I ask for a prompt. But longer context ability usually correlates to cheaper costs to train the same model with shorter context. So all these things they're connected in AI. So if you have a long context in a transformer model, it costs a lot of money to run. So what you do is like, oh, I have this alternative, which also has long context and costs less. But then you can also have the different architecture with a smaller context, and it costs a lot less than that. So all of a sudden, you can apply these things to spaces that are edge deployments. So if you want a model that runs on a phone, you can use this architecture much more easily compared to like a transformer-based architecture. So that's one approach. The other one is state space models. And again, I don't know how much people are going to care that are listening, but there's a lot of research basically going on. If you're an investor and you're being pitched, hey, we're going to beat OpenAI, what you want to ask is, okay, are you using the same transformer-based architecture that they are? If yes, pass. Now, all jokes aside, if yes, there needs to be two things. They either need to have a very unique data set that they're going to use to train the model, or they need to have an amount of compute that is like huge and that costs very little. Those things are basically, I just assume those things are impossible. Claude and Cohere, these people have billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they're still not better than GPT-4. So you just cannot come to me with a straight face and say, I'm going to build a better model than GPT-4. Just give me 5 million. It's not possible. So the alternative architectures are an interesting place to be. But again, sometimes it can be hard to then go from that to a company. You can figure out, okay, this thing actually works, but now you got to go raise 500 million and you got to go scale this out. And there's just a lot of things. And that's why I think open source is so promising, because you can then have Mamba is probably the best state space model out there right now. It's open source, so everybody can contribute and start to make it better without needing to build a company around it.
It's very helpful, and I think a lot of that really technical in the weeds knowledge is a lot of what you'll see in latent space here, podcasts and publication platforms. So I would definitely urge folks listening to check that out. Taking a step back, I'd love to get your thoughts on why you think it's an attractive time to deploy into these types of infrastructure, developer-facing businesses. Obviously, there are a lot of different areas within software, some which are receiving more attention than others right now. From your perspective, from a macro point of view, why do you think it's an attractive time to be investing in this space?
I would say for us, it's almost like it takes so much time to build these things that it doesn't really matter if it's a good time today. When you're investing in a developer tool company, again, it's always, for us, it's almost always pre-product. So you can assume that you'll have something like 12, 18 months. And then after that, you got to like take it to market. And so it's really hard to make decisions based on where the market is today when you're building these type of tools, because it's such a long lead time versus sometimes when you're building maybe like a consumer app, you really need to get the adoption right away to get the flywheel going. It's important to time it correctly. So that's almost one of the luxuries that we have. You know, if you think about when CrowdStrike was started, it's a massive public security company. Was that a good year for security? I don't know. They were consulting for a year and a half. Their early days were basically a newsletter of threat intel news. You know, they didn't even have a product. So what you're betting on is, again, going back to open source, the first couple of years, the founders are going to build a community and a tribe of people in their space, and they're going to try and build the product that becomes synonymous with what they're trying to solve as a problem. For us, it's always an attractive time.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I know that we're about up on time, but we do have 2 final questions for you, one of which is, what motivates you to work hard?
So SF, San Francisco to Rome is 6,245 miles or 10,000 kilometers. I'm really far from home. I'm here in SF because I think this is the best. Well, I'm actually in Redwood City, not SF, but anyway, it's the same to everybody else outside of it. I think this is the best place to do this job. And to me, if I'm here, it's because I want to do the best possible job that I can. I come from a family where people had to work really hard for not a lot. Like my dad, he delivers frozen food to restaurants at night. So he works 6 days a week. So he wakes up at 3:30 a.m. every day and goes to work for like 10 hours. I don't really work that hard compared to him. It's always thinking about what would my parents have done? Would they work as hard as this? Like, yeah. So it's like, I should do it too. And like, I'm here. So why not do it? You know? And yeah, I'm just passionate about this. I love technology. That's why I like the space that I'm in. I'm honestly interested in like how these things happen. Late in Space, we do the podcast every week. Like, it's a lot of work. I'm just interested in having these conversations. You really want to find yourself, especially when you're a young investor, if you're trying to really jam yourself into an investment strategy that you don't care about, you're just not going to have fun. And it's going to be hard to like really work hard, because you can fake it for 1 year, 2 years. People work 100 hours in IB, in investment banking, and they don't really want to do it. So I think 2 years is maybe the max that you can do it. In venture, you need, I mean, again, I've been doing this like 6-7 years. I never got in a carry check yet. The companies are still proving themselves out. So if you're not able to stay in the game for like a lot of years, it's really hard to have success. And it's really hard to stay in it if you don't like it. Because there's a lot of jobs. I could go run engineering as a company. I could go do a bunch of things that are less competitive and stressful than trying to be a VC. It's just not as motivating. So I think, yeah, if you're starting in venture, maybe you're like 2-3 years into it and you're like, maybe I don't like this as much, especially in this market. I think before the up rounds were coming for free every 6 months, and everything was good. All the companies could raise follow-ons, and now maybe it's a lot harder. You just got to be passionate about what you're investing in, and like just be genuinely interested in how the market is going to evolve, and that will give you enough to stay in it. And then if you stay in it long enough, that's one thing that I've noticed. If you stay in it long enough, other people are going to drop off. There are a lot of firms that 645 was being compared to when it first started that are not in business anymore. And it's just how the venture game works. You're not in it forever. You just got to survive long enough. The firms that are still here are the one that survived the longest.
Yeah, it's a long feedback loop. I mean, and you know, you spent so much time on Late in Space, which is the podcast that you host, really tailored towards technical individuals, bringing on a lot of the rising stars and prominent players within dev tools, data. Why do it, and what's the ROI or the benefit for you and your partner?
So there's a few things. One, your VC career, especially at the early stages, as good as the speed at which you find out new things, right? So you're always trying to make investments in things that are either known truths that you disagree with. So everybody thinks OpenAI is the best. I disagree. I have to invest in some. If OpenAI doesn't succeed, why is that? Why do I believe that's not going to be the case? And how do I invest in things that are going to succeed when that happens? So that's one way that the podcast is helpful. Hearing people's contrarian takes early and hearing it from people that are actually building in the space. And the other side, which is also super helpful with the podcast, is what are things that people don't yet believe that are going to be true soon? So for example, we had Codium, the AI assistant company that just raised like 30-40 million from Kleiner. We have Varun on the podcast a year ago. I think it was like our third guest or something. I mean, you could tell he's like special, and you could tell that most people at the time believe GitHub Copilot is going to win the whole category. There's not going to be a single startup worth anything. There's not going to be alternatives. I think if you ask people now, they would tell you Codium is better, Cursor is better. There's like a bunch of companies that are like real competitors to it. But early on, people didn't believe it. The same way people early on believed, oh, OpenAI is obviously not going to win. I've never seen something where the first comer always stays on the longest. And that's why you've seen a lot of money poured into Cohere, into Anthropic, and OpenAI is still winning. So even the billions don't. If you were trying to invest just on that thesis, you might maybe think, I should have just put it in OpenAI now. But yeah, for me, it's all about getting some of these things early. And the podcast also helps you crystallize your thoughts more. When you ask a question to somebody who's like really good at something, and then they ask you back, what do you think? You better have a good answer or it's not going to make for a good podcast. So that has been another good forcing function to do it. And now we've done 60 episodes. I think we had about 1.5 million people come to Latent Space in our first year. So people obviously like the content, and there are a lot of AI engineers out there. So this has become the go-to place for them to learn.
Great. Well, yeah, would certainly echo. Alessio, I'm glad you didn't ask me what I think on a few of these topics we've covered, because I've learned a ton in the conversation. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts and kind of giving our audience a quick window into what is covered in Latent Space.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. This was fun.